So a big thank you to Martha and everyone here. This is very cool. This is, it is a pretty easy softball pitch. It's like, hey, you want to come talk to a bunch of people as we hang out in a pub and just talk shop? I was like, yes, I do. That sounds great. And so Martha actually, I used to be a scientist. I might have lost, it's just from me. Great. Not working. Slight technical difficulties. We'll get there. So as we're working this out, so I'll just talk loudly, and again, throw up a hand, please, if you can't hear me. But I actually did. So when I went to college at Middlebury, I majored in chemistry. I minored in music enough to sort of be able to put it on my transcript, but I spent all of my time, or most of my time, in Bicentennial Hall. And after college, I moved out to Montana, where I was sort of a ski bum with a real job, in that I worked at the university in the chemistry department. And I spent 4 years in a bioinorganic lab as a researcher. And then I had my midlife crisis early, and I was actually applying to doctoral programs in chemistry, and I went to do an interview and visit, and I was in there, and we were all talking about who the possible cohort would be, and I was like, oh my gosh, I am nowhere near as good at it as these people are. Like, I can't, like, this is not me. I don't know what's happening. And so I freaked out, and then I followed the money, and I went to become a musician. But it is that was actually sort of very much my track. And so last year, one of the things I do at the Vermont Symphony is so I'm their artistic advisor and special projects conductor. And so I do a lot of the non-traditional things. So like a couple of years we did a silent movie night at Castleton. And so I did the arrangements and conducting for that. I run our jukebox concert series, which is actually shockingly similar to this in that it's much more informal by design and sort of, in a way, hearkening back to the way chamber music was first heard. And in people's houses, in a relaxed atmosphere, hanging out and having a drink during the concert and being able to talk and correspond with the audience, which historically in classical music we've gotten pretty far away from. And I split my life evenly I play with a lot of rock bands, and then I play with a lot of orchestras. And that middle ground where we take that ethos that happens in rock and roll and the music that is classical and where that Venn diagram hits, that's my sweet spot. That's what I love. And this is so in line with that. And so we did this show called The Sound of Science, and we did concert in the Paramount, but also one up at Beta Technologies in Burlington, who is one of the most daring companies I've ever met, where they're just like, well, we're going to change how airplanes work. That's their goal. They are creating the first, and bringing to market, they have created, but they're trying to bring to market electronically viable aircraft. And so, you look at carbon footprint, you would look at everything that happens, and air travel is one of the most egregious of those. And they're trying to fix that. It's wild. And so we did a show in their airplane hangar, and it was called The Sound of Science. And part of what that wrapped in was this art of data sonification. Because no matter what field you work in, we all deal with a lot of data. And sometimes it just feels like that, right? And again, it doesn't really matter where you are or what you do, but so much of what we do has to deal with numbers. And for people outside your field, it's often very hard to understand. And so in data, we look at how we can actually share information. And this is a real art form. We talk about data visualization, where we take those numbers and we transform them into something that might be intelligible to not people in the immediate vicinity of that but further afield. This is how much square footage you can buy with $1 million in major cities. And it's represented with colors and scale, and it's super interesting. And this is circa 2020, so I shudder to think of what it's like right now. And I don't want to know. So we have visualization. We also have things like animation. This is an amazing study that, for me, is one of the most poignant examples of data animation that I've ever seen, where you're not just looking at the way numbers interact, but they're using this to tell you a story. And we see, and let me actually just, to get the full picture there, all of these different variables in a 35-year study about how we grow up and where our trajectories might land, just the numbers. It's fascinating. And looking at it like this, you have such a different perception of what all these numbers say than if you were just internalizing it from a spreadsheet. And we also have what's called sonification. And sonification is the art of taking these numbers and using them to generate sound. And we'll talk about it a little bit in both the base level, but then also what artists and composers try to do with this, because I think that's where it gets super fascinating. But really, it is just the fact that we'll take a data point and we'll make it into sound. We see these all over the place in our everyday lives. If you hear a ticking clock, that tick does not have to necessarily be there. We could have a digital clock, but that is a marker of seconds. If you've ever seen a Geiger counter, or that is a sunset right in your eyes. If you need to move, oh, I feel for you. I know it's coming down fast. It's November officially now. A Geiger counter works with the principle of data sonification. Higher levels of radiation emit larger, louder ticks that at a higher cadence, and so we use these all over, and they're really useful because they show us different ways in which we can internalize numerical data or numbers or things that come our way. And so, for me, where the crux of this all hits is where you have data science and storytelling and try to put them together. And that's one of the principal techniques in data journalism. And so to break it down, we've got data science, which is those tables, numbers. Easy to understand for some people if you're in that world. Absolute gobbledygook if you're not, to be quite frank. We have data art. We saw with the visual. And that's a way of internalizing those numbers and presenting in a way. It doesn't necessarily have to tell a story, though. Data storytelling is where we see data art and data science interacted in that little circle of the Venn diagram. And so the goal with that is to really try to reach a broader audience. Because this stuff matters, right? That we do so much research and so much energy by people who are very, very smart, and conveying that to everyone else, it's a real thing. My older brother works out in Colorado and deals with aging. How do we age? Why do we age? Is there a way to age better? And presenting his findings, which are fascinating, he works really hard on not only putting them in the journals where he and his peers will read, and that's great, but then also trying to put them into like the Huffington Post, because that's a very, very different way of conveying that story. And so the storytelling is so cool to me. And so the way that we use sonification to tell a story is as follows. It can either complement a visualization, right? We can take one of those pieces of data art and we can have sound that complements it. It can underscore these relationships, trends, or patterns that we see. And this is where we take it next level. And then it gives us a way to hear and feel a concept. And this is sort of like my own, admittedly, like my own relationship with music, but sound is so tactile. Like, I know, it's not, it's very auditory, but the way that we hear it, I think it creates a physical response within us. And I think that's so beautiful because it allows us to grasp the story of this data in a completely different way. So what can this sound like? One of the programs that we'll talk about later, and by the way, I'll send out, for people who are on Martha's mailing list, I'll send out this presentation with the slides and links so that you can all have it and just look at it more, because I always feel like that. If I go to a talk, I'm like, oh man, what was said in like minute 3? I don't remember, but that was so important to me, and then I forget. And so I'm always happy to share. And the program that we'll look at a little later it's called Two-Tone, and it's a pretty marvelous sonification program where you are able to just pop in a spreadsheet and then allows it to be translated into sound. And I first started working with them a couple of years ago, and this little piece of music that they did was what made it all click for me. So they looked at the amount of snowfall over 50 years in, I'm sorry, not 50, 51 years in Donner Pass over in California. And they said, what if we take that number of the cumulative December snowfall and turn it into sound? What would that sound like? So if we get 17 feet of snowfall, which was the record, that sounds like that. If we get 6 inches, which we saw in December of 2017, if you remember, that directly preceded one of the largest droughts in California history, it sounds like 6 feet, which is a fairly normal year, sounds like that. And so this was generated through this program that allows you to take numbers and then extrapolate sound from them. So when we connect it all together, we have 50 years of snowfall in December from 70 to 21 in Donner Pass. It's so cool, so cool. And so this is where, yes, questions, please.
I wanted to ask, what were we hearing? Were we hearing all of the numbers at once?
So the question was, what were we hearing? And that was tracking it year by year, right? So that would be the year in 2021 where we got 17 feet. In 2017, that little nugget, which would happen, 85% of the way through because we're landing on 21, we get that little taste. So each sound are the years all strung together in chronological order.
Backwards or forwards?
Forward, starting with 1970 and ending on 2021. Yeah, and if there's any questions, please don't be shy, please.
So as a composer, when you hear that, how do you look at that music? Do you compose or is it erratic?
So I'm going to hang on to that question because we're going to have a direct answer to that with one of the things that with a piece that we'll listen to, a piece that we played at the Jukebox Concert Sound of Science using this program to compose, which I did, which was weird and hard to make it exactly what I want, but it's interesting. So yeah, we'll hold that. Yes, please.
Who makes the decision and how do they make the decision which sound to assign to which snow depth?
So the question was, who makes the decision and how is the decision made with the sounds that are assigned to each snow depth? And it is all based within this program. And so as you put in anything, and I'll zoom in just a little bit, but this is the Vermont State House Price Index quarterly from 2017 to today. We'll just look at this one, right? And so now, and I will say, this is data sonification perfectly done for everyone. You don't need to know anything about music in order to play with it, and that's one of the reasons why I love it. It's so democratic in nature. So you get to pick. Do you have a key that you like?
No, I don't.
Great. We'll stick with C minor. 4 octaves, 3 octaves, 2 octaves, 8 octaves. You got to pick one.
Simon said 4.
Simon says 4. Okay. We'll start there, that's fine. And then, would you like it to be a church organ? What are we feeling?
Mandolin.
Mandolin, all right. And so now, when we play this, and we'll have our house price index here, and it slowly rises in pitch as it keeps going up and up. But you can do lots of interesting things with it. You can make it descend. Maybe, I mean, we can get weird. We can be like, you know what? Maybe this is dark. Let's make it a church organ. We're all doomed. But this is a place where, again, it's very game and play based. So like, it's really, in this instance, it's whatever you want. And this is the program I use for it. So we track the housing inventory, which we can see what that happens with quarterly, which is this spreadsheet. Actually, I'll go to the main sheet. So if we look at the house price index versus the active listing count in Vermont versus homes listed as short-term rentals, we could see if we can create a sonic relationship to those. And full disclosure, like I played around with this just for a little bit when I did it, and it's fun. Fun. But we can see that as the house price index rises and inventory falls, and short-term rentals go to almost 12,000 versus 2,300. And so this is a way of looking at something that affects really all of us. And so if we take this program, twotone.net, again, I'll send you a link to it all. We can take this Vermont price index versus the housing inventory. And just so we're all clear, the way that I did it was I literally dragged this spreadsheet into the browser. And the homes listed as short-term rentals. What do we feel for the housing inventory? What kind of instrument? What's that? Trumpet. Great. And short-term rentals? Violin. And you can mute different tracks. Again, you can play with the key. They're all in C minor right now. But we can go back and we can hear, again, it's very fun. What does it sound like if we have these 3, and I'll show the spreadsheet numbers as well, these 3 data points being listed against one another. Again, our house price index, the number of inventory, and the number of short-term rentals. Maybe not the greatest work ever. But again, this is truly game-based. We'll see what this is capable of, I think, later when you really put a lot of time into it. And this was the program, again, that they used to create the Snowfall and Donner Pass. And so how does it all work, especially from the landscape and lens of being a composer and a creator? And so it's hard, and I think full disclosure, we see things being really difficult with this. It kind of harkens back for a lot of the very scientific approaches that music has seen, and then a lot of the wonderfully weird hippie approaches in the 60s, which music saw too, where if you have composers like John Cage, the concept of giving up control. Because if you are working with an external data set or something else, you're kind of giving up a little bit of control over the process because you have this external influence on you, which is really neat. And so it can be a storytelling tool and a compositional tool. There's a couple of pitfalls that are good to avoid, being boring or repetitive or monotonous, trying to understand how much you want to tell of the story and what that story is you're trying to tell. And then there's also the question that any composer who uses this or any sort of thing, external influence in the creative process, how true do you want to be to that? Like, I'm not gonna lie, I didn't really dig that beginning of the housing price piece we listened to. Do I want to go in and change notes? I don't know if I do, because then that is sort of the musical equivalent of fudging the data. And so it takes a lot of work in order to make it, I think, be effective. The things that we often do is we map data onto pitch. It's a very clear relationship that we can understand as humans. Timbre, the color or the sound that we're hearing, the duration, volume, how loud or soft it is, and then also rhythmic density, like how fast things go. We rarely change tempo, and I think that's because, especially within music, we need like a sometimes. We need that guide, especially if time is in any component whatsoever. But the goal is to really show trends and highlights. This link here, which we won't look at, but this is a very powerful piece that came across my way a bunch of years ago. The number of air raids, essentially, in Yemen, which is off the charts. And these folks, this link will take you to their process, which they tell everything that they did with the data in order to make this. It's a video piece out of it, where there's percussive sounds every time there's an air raid, and every day represents 1 second. And the intensity of the percussive sounds reflects how many air raids were present that single day. And for me, watching the video is more poignant and more striking than just reading a list of numbers, because it pushes you in a certain way. In the interest of time, we're not going to look at that, but that link, if anyone does get super interested, go check that out, because it's super cool, and they run through their process. We're going to look at some examples now. This is one of my UVM students. We did an Eclipse project. They had to write songs made out of Eclipse. And so Lorelei took all of the relevant Eclipse dates that happened within Vermont. On 8/31 in 1932, there was a total eclipse in northeastern Vermont. On May 10th in 94, annular eclipse in much of Vermont. On April 8th in 24, our total eclipse. May 1st in 2079, there will be another total eclipse across far southern Vermont. And in 2093, on July 23rd, there will be an annular eclipse across all of Vermont. And so what Lorelei did was she took all of these different dates and assigned them to a pitch. And this is an instance of having something generated for you that you never would have otherwise done. So she made a melody. In the key of A minor, anytime there was a 0, she had a rest. An 8, she had an A. A 3, C, 1, A. And so in an A minor scale, da 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 da, that's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9. And she used those to help guide what her melody would be. And so when you hear this song, which is a little eclipsical waltz, there's a marimba melody that is generated solely by those numbers and dates. So super cool because, again, it was like nothing she would ever come up with by herself. The other couple of examples, and again, if there's any questions at any point or thoughts, please feel free to raise a hand. The couple that we'll look at now take it kind of next level, which is really interesting. So at our Sound of Science concert, we had two pieces that, again, were some of the ones that really clued me in on this concept of data sonification. The first was Planetary Bands by a Minnesota composer named Daniel Crawford. And then we also asked my friend Peter Hamlin, who is up at Middlebury, to make something out of a piece he'd already done. And so, again, these both tell stories. We'll talk about Peter's piece and then listen to Daniel's piece, which is just 2 minutes long. Peter is a sailor, loves sailing. It's where basically it's half the reason he came to Vermont is because of Lake Champlain, and he moved back here in order to be close, and it's his happy spot. And his boat is up in Kingsland Bay, and nearby is Diamond Island in Ferrisburg. And Diamond Island, and we're gonna get super heady just for a little bit, but it's cool, I promise you. Diamond Island has a weather station that tracks all the data you could ever want every 15 minutes. So it looks at the wind speed, the wind direction, the water temperature, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what Peter wanted to do was take those numbers and be like, what would happen if I tried to make a piece of music that told the story of being on the lake for a single day? And so he came up with this wonderfully brilliant idea. For people who play music, this is what we call the circle of fifths. And it represents all our keys. C major, A minor, all the white keys on the piano, G flat, F sharp minor, sort of all the black keys on the piano. They're about as far away as we can get. And what Peter said was that every time I have a wind direction, I'm going to take my compass rose and map it onto my circle of fifths. So if we have a wind coming from the north, we're in C major. If we have a wind coming from the east, A major. From the south, F sharp major. From the west, E flat major. And what this does for him is if you go between the close spots, if you go between A flat and E flat, everything sounds very natural. They're very closely related. It doesn't sound dissonant at all. It's very consonant. If you go the opposite direction, from say A flat to D major, they're as different as they sound. And just by being placed near one another, there's a lot of turmoil, a lot of dissonance, a lot of crunchiness that emits from it. And so every single time the wind direction changed, it changes key. And again, these are decisions he would never make by himself. And then depending upon the wind speed, the quartet would play 4 different musical gestures. If it's calm, nice long slow notes. If there's a light breeze, it gets a little crazier. And we could just see this with just the rhythmic density, more notes. A moderate wind, a little crazier still. And then strong winds, we know that we're playing super loud, we're playing intense, we're playing as fast as we basically can. Brilliant. And it was really, really cool to watch. And so that's one aspect, again, of taking data and mapping out different parts of a song. The other one is this. And this, to me, is one of the most amazing pieces that I've ever listened to. It's called Planetary Bands, and it's by Daniel Crawford, who was a student at the University of Minnesota. And he took all the temperature data from 1880 to 2014 in our different latitudes. He gave it to a string quartet, and he assigned different members to live within those latitudes. So the first violin is responsible for the Arctic. The violin 2, the high latitudes. Viola are mid-latitudes, and then cellos in the equatorial zone. And one of the things that I think is so poignant about this is when we talk about a warming planet, climate change, it can be very dependent upon where you are and what happens, and it's not the same everywhere. And in the message, things sometimes get lost. And we look at the change that happens in the equatorial zone versus so the equator rises 1.1 degrees Celsius. The Arctic, on the other hand, rises almost 3 degrees Celsius. And so it's a huge change, and we see that being manifested in different ways. And why this is so cool, and what I want you to do as we watch it, is think about the physicality of playing it. Because the best music for me, I think, and some of the most rewarding, is where the physicality matches what's happening. And where the cello starts and where the cello ends, versus where the poor first violin starts and the poor first violin ends, is unbelievably different. And it's a physical stretch, not for the cello to play. The cello in the equator has it easy peasy lemon squeezy this whole way through. But that first violin is up way above the stratosphere just trying to hit the right notes because so much change has undergone. So this is Daniel Crawford's Planetary Bands.
This is our newest composition, Planetary Bands, Warming World.
Cellist says it's so easy. And you can see the first violinist over on the right side of the screen getting so far up the fingerboard of the violin. Those notes are so hard to play up there and have them be in tune. And so in delivering this message of climate change and showing where things land and how it actually is going, extremely powerful piece, extremely powerful piece. And so the last thing that we'll talk about today will be showed using this program, two-tone. Again, you can throw any spreadsheet in there. I kind of downloaded a bunch of spreadsheets from the Vermont libraries and played around with them too. There's a lot of data online you can get about the Vermont libraries. You can make sound out of it. Number of borrowers, it's fascinating. But you can drop something in and it will assign musical values to it. And so at our jukebox concert, I used this program, which full disclosure, this is the first time I ever did anything like this, and it was very weird for me. Very, very hard, too, to write a song about Lyme disease. I mean, so who got a tick on them this year? Yep. Who's had Lyme disease? Yep. We're all at least my age. Who had Lyme disease when they were a kid? Very rare, yeah. Who saw ticks when we were young, running around? Yep, very rare though, right? And so I have very clear memories. I grew up in New Jersey, and when I was born in 1980, and right around the late 80s, things started being like, oh, okay, this is a thing. And all my brothers and sisters and I got Lyme disease a handful of times because we were just running around the woods and we didn't know any better yet. And then one of my best friends, Ryan, his older sister got Lyme disease and it was not treated and caught, and she was paraplegic for the rest of her life. And so it's the concept again of like, this has real ramifications. And not only that, when we think about climate change and the way it affects us, one of the things that I like to think about is there's a lot of big picture doom and gloom. You're right, like Miami's gonna sink, that's gonna happen, we know it. All the icebergs and glaciers are gonna melt, that's gonna happen too. I lived in Montana for a bunch of years and worked in Glacier National Park. I don't know if my kids are gonna see those glaciers. That's true. But none of that affects us personally on a daily level. And in and amongst climate change, there's all these, pun intended, little things that affect us every day. And something like ticks and Lyme disease, right? We have 3 kids, and when we send them out, like, we do tick checks all the time. And then there's the little mental hurdles where our tiny 6-year-old, who is a wild child, will, just like go crushing around in tall grass. And I'm like, yeah, great. Don't get a tick, right? So our entire perception of just being outside has changed. I think that's no matter who you are. You have to be different about just being in the out of doors during tick season. And so in order to look at this and what it would sound like, I wanted to say uber focus on Vermont. So the Fairbanks Museum tracks temperature since 1880. So I took 50 years of temperature data, a little inspired by planetary bands. And then I tracked the number of cases of Lyme disease from the CDC that were reported in Vermont. And I know it says on the slide, but any guesses as to when the first disease was? When was the first reported case? 1988. Yeah, So this is, all things told, fairly fresh. And we see a steady increase all the way through the 90s, both in relation to temperature and case count. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to see if I could tell the story and draw the correlation of rising temperatures, which is just one of the factors of why we have a greater prevalence of ticks. But that has ramifications upon populations of mice and animals, then yada, 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 versus the number of cases of Lyme disease that we see reported. And so here we see it in table form. 1970, we averaged 43 degrees Celsius. We keep going through. 88, as we hit 44.73, we see our first case of Lyme disease appear. Little bitty increases, but nothing crazy. We keep cruising. Our temperature hits into the 45s. It gets a little louder. At 2006, we crossed the 100-case threshold, and we have 100 cases reported. Bear in mind, this is only those reported and marked by the CDC. In 2006, our temperature keeps cruising up. We crossed 46. We're in the 500s. We crossed 2016. We hit 47.7 degrees Celsius for the first time. In 2017, we have 1,002 cases of Lyme disease registered in the state. And then in 2019, which is slightly cut off, we have 1,064. And so it's very hard not to draw a correlation to that based upon the science that talks about the spread of ticks and the rise of Lyme disease. And so, how do I put that into music? And I hope we all can see this. It's might be a little far away for some folks, but see if I can tighten that up. Nope, that's okay. I'll talk through it. But so using this program, Two-Tone, I made a spreadsheet. I looked at, well, I don't have it open, but I looked at this, and I took that spreadsheet and I dumped it into the program. And then that program can do two things. It can either generate out sound or it can generate out notes that you can use. And so me being a composer, I wanted to put out notes that I can actually use. And so I took this and I used it. And so every 2 bars is equal to 1 year. And the lower line tracks the temperature, which I'll talk through as we see it. And then the upper 2 lines are, so the viola and cello, which are these 2 instruments there, they are completely respondent to just temperature, nothing else. The upper 2 lines are the cases of Lyme disease. And so, when we look at it, we start in 1970, and we're just cruising for a while. Oh, letter A up there, that's 1980, we're still cruising. No cases of Lyme disease yet. We can slowly hear the pitch of the cello and the violin getting higher, though. 1988, which is letter B, we see our very first case of Lyme disease represented by just a single note in the violin, because we only have 1. 2 years later, we have 2 cases and 2 notes. Another 2 years later, 6 cases, and when you add the notes of the violins together, we have 6 notes. And so all of these notes were actually generated from me from the program, but I chose to make our artistic decisions about it. And so I would cut out notes, basically, to represent the number of cases that we got. Here again, we have 6 notes. At letter C, we have 12 notes, and we see 12 cases of Lyme disease. We also have a jump from 45 to 46, from 44 to 45 degrees, and we see a slight technique change in the viola and cello. We keep going, and as the violins play, you can just see the cases of Lyme disease increasing and increasing until we hit letter D, which is 2000. We have 40 cases of Lyme disease. Temperatures are cruising around almost 46 consistently at this point. And then at letter E, we are jumped to over 100 cases of Lyme disease. The violins have no more rests for the rest of the entire piece of music because there's no rest from Lyme. And then at letter F, it's sort of where all hell breaks loose, if you pardon my French. But we crest 500 cases and we never look back. We're cruising at 46 degrees right now still, and we get higher and higher and higher until we finally end with everyone playing as loud, as fast, and as hard as they can. And so, when we hear what this actually sounds like, the goal for me was to try to, again, just try to showcase, showcase is a weird word, try to tell, again, it's like telling that story of what we've all lived through if we lived in Vermont for a while, which is a rise of a disease. And tracking it, again, our cello and viola are temperature gradients, and then the violins are Lyme disease. And so this is the jukebox quartet from the Vermont Symphony, which is John Dunlop on cello, Steph Taylor on viola, and then Jane Kittredge and Brooke Quiggins on violin. It starts so nice and calm. .2 degrees. We just hit letter A, which is 1980. 44.5 degrees. .9 as the temperature keeps rising. First case. Four cases, or two. 6 cases. 2. We're at letter C right now. .40 cases at 2,000. We now cross 100 cases for the first time. So we're at 500 cases and counting right now. Over 1,000 cases. A little less, we had a down year. But right back at you. And so again, all of that information generated solely from this very first spreadsheet of what is our rising temperature, how does it progress, what are the number of cases that we have within that landscape that are then being reflected and influenced by that rise. So, yes?
Have you considered adding a line that would indicate rainfall versus drought?
In the early days, I was like, do we want to? So I actually didn't think about rainfall versus drought, but I was like, should the cello be like the large animal population? Should I make John be a moose? Like, what do I want to do here? And it was a conversation internally, trying to figure out what's the story that I want to be able to tell and how, because that would be a really interesting one, and especially with more people. You know, you can hear that layer being added into it. And I think that's where it gets really powerful, right? Because this gives you a different way to feel, to understand, to experience something. And I think that's where, you know, hopefully data sonification has its legs. Yes?
As a composer, if you were putting this out for people to hear, I've sat through a lot of violin concerts for cellos,
Mm-hmm.
five, and it can be very boring. But without this information, are people willing to listen to that and honor you as a composer?
No. Absolutely. So, I'll come back to a real answer in a second. So the question was that, but it's true, sort of. So the question was really, you know, if there's a lot of concerts, there's a lot of, as you were saying, you've sat through a lot of string quartet, which I have too. And part of it is that makes this relevant is the information. And the question was, would people be willing, if I can paraphrase, be willing to digest and discover that information on their own or understand it without it? And I don't think so. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I think that's just the reality of the way that we are. We live in an age of information where there's so much that we consume. Side note, part of, let me just be this a plug, but I do truly believe that. And I think that come to our jukebox concert. We'll be at Paramount Theater in 2 weeks. I host and curate them, and they've been my baby. And part of it is being like, having the right avenue into music to understand it and have fun. It's not, and it's on purpose, relaxed and low key, and like this information would have a fit in there because it's hard to understand it without it, or you miss the point.
Well, we serendipitously listened to a documentary about John Williams last night, and he had none of this to use. He just did it.
Still uses a pencil.
Yep.
And so, and of course, we love his music and we honor him.
And I think that this is where, and then the comment was, you know, you watched the documentary on John Williams last night, and there's none of this that is, and I think that, yeah, I mean, and in a way, the music that John Williams writes doesn't need that. Right? He is brilliant. And also I used a pencil on this too. I'm very much a pencil paper into a computer program kind of guy. It makes me think differently. And I think within the landscape of music, again, like we live in this world where there's so many different types of art that we ingest, and like some you don't need this for. The piece that we just listened to, I don't know if it would play without it. And I say that as being like the dude who wrote it. Like without all that information behind it, it's not quite as effective. And I think that's okay. At least I don't worry about it too much.
What's the applications of it?
So we got a couple of questions. We'll circle right around. So I think the applications of it are using it to tell a story in a different way. In the same, like, when we listen to John Williams, it's either likely in a movie score, or likely in a way that you're picking out a theme or a song or a suite from a movie, right? And you're listening to it not necessarily like this. But if you were having a place where you were trying to share something, put it in a museum, put it up in the Fairbanks. We've talked about that actually with the curators. They're like, what would it look like? Can you put on a pair of headphones and listen to this in the Fairbanks Museum, where you're there for a learning experience, where you're there for something different, that it does allow that story to be told, again, in a way that is different, because we all know this story, but how do we underscore its poignancy? And again, this is not for, and the other thing I'll say is, like, this is not for all music, right? This is for a way that you can create interesting works, and they have their right time and place. But I personally don't know anyone, nor will I personally. Was I running back to use that program again to write some music? No, that's not. It's just because it's not my style, though. It's not who I am. But for other people, it's much more in line with what they do. Back there, yes, please.
I see the entertainment value of this, but there's an awful lot of potential negatives in manipulating people's feelings and perceptions, like in political ads or ads for cars on TV. They're playing with us already. And the more we know about that, the more somebody's going to use it for something bad.
True, but I think that's also like any tool in a lot of ways, right? Because it is like, and so the comment was that, again, to paraphrase, like, this can be manipulative, right? Is what you were saying?
Yeah, I worked for a defense contractor where we had people working in our unit whose job was to manipulate the data to make our customer think that we produced something that was good.
Yep. Absolutely, and I think that's where it gets into the concept of having a certain morality with what you're producing, right? Because, and again, like, I could have fudged those numbers to tell my story. Would you have known any better? So, it's really, it's a scary world that we live in, I think, and there's an effort to understand how to be truthful. A couple more. We have about 5 minutes left. Yeah. Yes.
Me?
Yes.
Well, one of the difficult things in science, and I see there's a difficulty here, is this is all correlation. But distinguishing correlation from cause and effect is difficult, and probably you haven't thought of it beyond correlation yet. But for this to be useful at all, more than just fun, maybe you just want to have fun.
And so the question was, this is all correlation rather than causality. Accurate, right? And we in the landscape of this, we're still drawing correlations, and we don't have absolute evidence of direct causality. And I think that that's any science in so many ways, right? Unless you have a long-term, multi-year study with controls, your causality is truly hard to come by, especially in big picture things like this. And so for me, at least personally, there's a little less worrying about that. And I think just being open about that, right? We think about how we use this to generate art, and I think that we can tell a story of correlation, and I feel okay about that, at least me as the creator. But it's a very, very fair point taken in that there is a very, and this will come into my research background, right? There is very clear moments of correlation and causality and large, large, large differences. I hear you. We have to go to the back and then I'll go to you. Yeah?
What do you know about occupational uses of this sort of technique, like in hospitals with machines just beeping everywhere? Do you know about anyone who's ever tried to use this to make their jobs easier in hospitals?
Great question, and no. I love it, though.
Research project?
Research project, amen. Absolutely, yeah.
If you were scoring a documentary on something like climate change, would you use
So the question was, which is a complicated question, was if I was scoring a documentary on climate change, would I use this or would I just trust the gut more? And I think it's different pieces of art. And so I would likely trust my gut more, although I might want to mess around with this and play with this, even though it would be just like a little Easter egg nugget for me as the creator, as opposed to anything that would be, because then it becomes down into function of music. And like, this was sort of designed to be function like we just did, like listen to it, look at the numbers, and then like, that's it, right? But if you're scoring a film or documentary, then you really have a clear functionality that this might not be the right approach for that. And so, but I think but again, it's just a role of functionality more than anything. One more, and then we have to knock off, but I'll be around and we can hang. We got, 2 more. It'll be, sorry, Martha. We'll go there and then we'll go there. Yes?
Yes, you mentioned the colors of notes a while ago. I'm wondering, do you think it would be worthwhile working with people with synesthesia to inform your project?
So the question was synesthesia, the neurological response of actually hearing color or seeing color when you hear a pitch, whether that would be useful to inform things like this. I don't know, but it'd be super cool. And from my friends who have synesthesia, it's much more an involuntary response than anything that is measurable, right? And so if they hear a note, then it will trigger, a color in their brain. So the same thing as look like, my shirt is kind of tan. They'll be like, that's an F sharp. And so it's more involuntary than anything else. But I think wrapping them into them in some way could have really interesting effects for sure. Last one.
Thank you, but she stole my question.
Good. We'll go to the back there, yeah.
As a musician, you can hear in a multiple instrument presentation, you can hear the individual voices of the instrument much better than those of us who are not trained to hear that. And if the individual voices represent individual columns, how many columns each point is you can no longer discern, and it becomes a total blend that no longer gives information.
So the question was, being a musician, like if you live in the world of music a lot, you can often parse out multiple musical lines, multiple musical thoughts happening. And like, I can do like 5, which, and it's only because I've been doing it for years. I have a professor who was brilliant, Martin Amlin, and he, over at Boston University, he specialized in Bach counterpoint. And I swear the dude can hear like 8 voices at once and then just tell you everything that's going on, because that was his world and he loved it. And so at what point does it just become white noise? And I think for me, after 5 voices probably and 5 different musical concepts and lines going through, I'm like, it's too much information, I can't parse it out anymore. And so it's really dependent, but yeah, that's one of the big things about sonification or any sort of process like this where delivery and reception becomes tantamount, right? How much can we get across with our point before it becomes unintelligible? Which is no different than writing a journal article, really, when it all comes down to it, right? You're trying to get your point across, and then I remember the first time I had to read a real article, and I was like, oh my gosh, I just read for 2 hours, and I don't know anything that I read. And then you go back and you learn how to read an article in a journal. Same process and same approach. So, thank you. Do you want this?
Those of you who made dinner reservations, or even if you didn't make dinner reservations, enjoy dinner if you plan to stay. Thank you for coming.
Thank you all so much.